891 Microcellular Regrowth. From its inception, Pinnacle Research has always focused on what they called the betterment of the human race. Every experiment they ran in the early days of the organization was intended to improve the lives of the people around them. They wanted to solve the difficult problems in an attempt to rid the world of as many of the terrible things that plagued mankind as they could. While there were some failures over the years, a large majority of their work was successful. They even shared their research with the world outside of the doors of their research facility. Medical professionals all around the world were able to use that same research and help their own people. The group was widely praised for following through on their mission to make life on this planet better for all humans. Then, one day, they stopped completely. Pinnacle researchers no longer attended the events that they had before. They no longer participated in group studies or collaborated with other medical professionals that wanted to use their advanced techniques. In fact, it was like they had almost disappeared completely. No matter how many times the medical community reached out, they were greeted in the same way. They were politely told that Pinnacle would no longer be participating in any external collaboration or sharing. Needless to say, the medical community was stunned. After contributing so much for so long, going completely silent left them with a gaping hole where Pinnacle and its research had once been. Over the next several months, the shock of Pinnacle's about-face began to wear off. Other research groups rose up and tried to fill the hole that Pinnacle had left, with varying degrees of success. Inside of Pinnacle, the story was much different. While some researchers questioned the decisions of the company to cut themselves off from the outside world, others simply nodded along in agreement as the management described their new approach. All research performed by Pinnacle is to be kept completely confidential, they'd said. They even went so far as to have updated contracts for the researchers to sign, stating that any and all actions and knowledge they gained while in their employment was never to leave the facility. It also used the vague term occupational repercussions when referring to the end of their employment there. Most happily signed the new agreement, some without reading it at all. A few, concerned about the change, refused. They were told to gather their things and were escorted out of the building. A week later, one was found dead on the floor in his home, appearing to have slipped and struck his head hard on the kitchen counter. Shortly after, another was hit by a car while out on a bike ride, breaking his neck instantly. While the deaths concerned some of the remaining researchers, others were happy to continue on with their work. They were assigned a new experiment that sought to better humanity by helping those that had lost a limb. They wanted to avoid some of the more gruesome options, such as surgically reattaching a donor limb, in favor of a more elegant approach. They studied various animals that were able to regrow portions of their bodies when damaged or cut off: starfish, iguanas, alligators. They theorized that if they were able to isolate how these creatures were able to regenerate, they could induce that same kind of approach in amputees with hopes of regrowing, in part or in whole, the appendage they'd lost. Researchers knew that many of the animals were able to regenerate because of an excess of stem cells in their system. Humans produced some, but not to the same levels. They knew that the level of regeneration they were expecting would require an immense amount of cells. After a few rounds of trial and error, they discovered that the human body simply couldn't produce enough on its own, even enough to kickstart the process. They resorted to other, less reputable approaches to gather the amounts that they needed. In the end, they only managed to gather enough for 2 subjects. They needed to choose wisely. Theorizing that a subject that had lost a smaller part of their body might make the process easier for their bodies to manage, they selected 2 men from the list of volunteers that had each lost one hand. Both agreed to the procedure, excited that it might mean they could live a normal life again. Both subjects were brought to the facility and lightly sedated. This was followed by an injection with a specialized virus designed to alter their bodies and force rapid production of part of the stem cells that were necessary. At the same time, they were given a series of injections containing the remainder of the cells that they had gathered directly into the place where their hand was amputated. Then, they waited. Over the next several hours, it seemed like the experiment was a failure. Nothing had changed about the subjects or the site of their amputation. They decided to keep the men for observation overnight to see if it was going to require more time. Both agreed and quickly drifted off to sleep. Sometime around 1 a.m., alarms went off in the room of one of the subjects. The researchers on staff rushed into his room, bursting through the door. They were too late, however. He had already died. They noticed that there was something odd about his face, though. While it wasn't overly pronounced, his features seemed to have shifted to the right, giving his face a lopsided sort of look. With nothing left to do but handle the disposal of the body, the team of researchers moved to the room next door to check on the other subject. As they walked through the door, a metal and plastic chair narrowly missed them and went crashing to the floor. The subject stood on the other side of the room, seething with rage, a murderous look in his eyes. He alternated between screaming at them and doubling over in pain, grabbing his right shoulder. One researcher ran quickly back out the door to retrieve medication to sedate the man, while the others approached him and tried to subdue him until the other researcher could return. All 5 of them moved in at the same time, 4 grabbing his arms and legs, and 1 holding his head. After several long minutes of struggle, they finally wrestled him to the floor. All the while, he was screaming at them, tears rolling down his cheeks. Finally, the researcher returned with the medication, and soon the subject was unconscious on the floor. They lifted him back to the bed and strapped him in, checking the restraints multiple times to ensure he couldn't get loose. They left the room exhausted from their struggle and returned to their stations to monitor him for the remainder of the night. Eventually, morning came, and the next shift arrived to relieve the night staff. As a precaution, one of them went in to check on the subject to see if there had been any change in his physiology. His vitals appeared normal, and he seemed to be resting comfortably despite the restraints. As the researcher turned to leave, they saw movement under the subject's gown near his shoulder. They almost discounted it as the subject simply shifting in the bed, but it happened again, accompanied by a small, quiet moan. The researcher reached out and slowly pulled the gown down from the top of his shoulder. The researcher jumped back, revolted by what they'd uncovered. There, protruding from the shoulder of the subject, was a lump the size of a tennis ball, connected to the rest of his body by a series of small bones thinly covered by a layer of skin. Veins pulsated and bulged from the top of it as it swayed back and forth on the subject's shoulder. Horrified, the researcher felt frozen to the spot. Eventually, he swallowed down his panic and slowly moved around the bed, morbid curiosity pushing him to see the other side. The same veins that had crisscrossed the other side grew closer together, gathering to a central point. As he watched, the skin where they converged and bulged shifted. The skin stretched, pulling tightly over something, trying to push its way through. The skin stretched to its limits, began to tear in places with a wet, sticky sound. It erupted from the surface, continuing to pull at the skin nearby as it stretched and moaned softly. Protruding from the subject's shoulder was a misshapen head, with a single eye set deep in its socket and purplish red muscles holding its jaw in place. It began to open and close its mouth repeatedly, moaning quietly as more of the skin around it began to tighten. The researcher backed away, knocking over a tray of equipment. The thing turned towards him slowly, staring at him with that one unblinking eye. The researcher panicked and raced for the door. He threw it open, the handle crashing loudly into the wall behind it. He ran through it with only one thought filling his mind: escape. As he crossed the threshold of the door, he quickly glanced back over his shoulder. There, next to the head, was now a short appendage, bent in the middle with 5 bumps on the end. And it was reaching for him.